Sheriff, death has come to your little town. On this week's episode of the Nerd Byword podcast, we are tackling nerd news with Spider-Man 3 news, Invincible trailer dropping. On our Byword Big Talk, we're looking at the film The New Mutants and our thoughts on it. And in our Nerd Nightmare segment, we're looking at John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978.
Ladies and gentle nerds, welcome back to another episode of the Nerd Byword podcast. We're excited to have you with us this week, where we are going to do a extreme deep dive into the movie New Mutants, the dirty leftovers of the Fox X-Men franchise. But before we get to our deep dive, let's go ahead and check in with Kris for some nerd news. Kris, what do you have this week for us?
Well, the internet is on fire with Spider-Man 3 speculation. This all started when Jamie Foxx was rumored to be returning to the role of Max Dillon Electro. And that was met with, mixed praise and criticism by fans online. Amazing Spider-Man 2, by no stretch of the imagination, is a good film. I'm in the camp that was a creative, from the top down, just a bad decision. Jamie Foxx is a talented actor. I mean, he's turned in some amazing performances. And I see where they went with that, and I think it was just a creative, decision, top down. Is really, his portrayal was, at least as the Max Dillon persona, was very goofy and campy, and just did not work. But I'm hoping that we could just credit that to the creative thing, because there was a lot of things going on with that movie that were wrong, like the super spy parents, which, if you've read Amazing Spider-Man annuals, that's probably, and even Amazing Spider-Man comics, that's probably one of the weaker storylines throughout the years of Amazing Spider-Man comics. And then they also went with this very, very rushed origin story with Harry Osborn, this very, very rushed friendship, and a really horrible character design of the Green Goblin. So if you had all those things up, I think Jamie Foxx's Electro is probably the least of the evils there. So it all started with that. But then you started getting rumors that Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield were also going to be reprising their roles, and that really just fanned the flames of like a Spider-Verse, multiverse situation. When you combine that, and then it was all brought home by the fact that it was confirmed that Benedict Cumberbatch will be appearing as Doctor Strange in the third MCU Spider-Man film. So when you combine that with the WandaVision trailer that was released and, the speculation of a multiverse situation being there, and then you have the actual title of the next Doctor Strange film being The Multiverse of Madness, and then all of these Spider-Man 3 rumors, fanboys are just going crazy online, Dave. What do you think of all this?
As is usual for me with the MCU Spider-Man franchise, I'm really of two minds of this. On the one hand, the hints that there's some sort of multiverse story going on, that's intriguing to me. Into the Spider-Verse showed how well those sorts of stories can work. And the presence of Doctor Strange, as you mentioned, hints in this direction, as does, Jamie Foxx's Electro returning. The rumors that Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield are in talks to reprise their versions of Spider-Man sounds like a lot of fun too. On the other hand, I find myself a little disappointed that we once again can't get a quintessential Spidey movie. Marvel seems to be so unwilling to let Spider-Man be Spider-Man. Tony Stark is dead, so now we need Doctor Strange as a mentor figure. Why exactly? Is it so impossible for Spidey to stand on his own 2 feet in these movies, to illustrate his growth and just be Spider-Man without extensive help? And yes, Jamie Foxx is super talented, but his Electro hails from what I probably would say is the worst Spider-Man movie. It's sort of the Batman and Robin of the Spider-Man franchise. That just misfire after misfire in that movie. And so the actor returning is a good idea, but it can't be that version of the character. It has to be some kind of riff to differentiate itself from Amazing Spider-Man 2, because it just did not work. Period. So on the one hand, there's some great storytelling potential here, and on the other hand, I just want a Spidey movie that doesn't feature the Avengers changing Peter Parker's diaper.
Yeah, and I remember when the Marvel and Sony split first dropped in, and I kind of was in the camp with a lot of Spider-Man fans that, was upset about it, but then, I kind of shifted. The more I really, really meditated on it, the more I postulated on the idea. Spider-Man has such like a deep character universe and has such like a wellspring of story material that he doesn't need this really extended universe. If there's one character in Marvel Comics that doesn't need other characters, I know that, he had Marvel Team Up, and that was, a really important part of, comics, through the 70s and 80s. But like Spider-Man can stand alone, and to see all this, that's what I was, kind of looking forward to with like the film properties kind of weaning off of the MCU and, returning those film rights back to Sony. That's what I kind of comforted myself with. Well, like, okay, as long as Tom Holland, and people like John Watts are still involved, like I'm hopeful for the future. But, I kind of see what you're saying here, and I would like to let just Spidey be Spidey, and it's really, troublesome. I'm in the minority of a lot of Spider-Man fans. Like, I'm not a fan. I said this on Twitter the other day, and it kind of, didn't react well. I'm not a fan of Tobey Maguire's, Peter Parker, or Kirsten Dunst's MJ. Like, those just don't land well for me. They haven't aged well. I have a lot of respect for Andrew Garfield's interpretation of the role. I think a lot of the problems with Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst, like, it's really hard for me to believe that they are high school students. Where Tom Holland and Zendaya, they are in their early 20s, but they look much younger than that, so that's a little bit more believable. And while Andrew Garfield's portrayal seemed a little bit, early 20s-ish, but I kind of like the choices that he made as an actor, and I feel similarly to the Jamie Foxx situation, is like a lot of those were just creative problems from the top down. But I liked, even when you just look at the casting, like Sally Field as Aunt May, that's fantastic. When you have, Martin Sheen as Uncle Ben, that should be fantastic. And it's just really disappointing. Those movies are probably the most disappointing because of all the potential that was there, what they should have been. So I'm hopeful going forward, I guess, to see like kind of a necessary, due diligence, I guess, for the Amazing Spider-Man franchise. And like, because I think Andrew Garfield is a very, very talented actor, and I really liked a lot about what he and especially Emma Stone's Gwen Stacy, their chemistry, even though I think she was a lot MJ in Gwen Stacy. But I'm really hoping if we can get a nugget from that if it is indeed involving all three of these Peter Parkers, that we can kind of get some closure there.
Yeah, hot take right here. I'll just admit it. I like Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker Spider-Man best of all the portrayals I've seen on the big screen so far. And this is not, anything against Tom Holland, who is in essence Bendis' ultimate Spider-Man in all but name. Whereas sort of main Marvel Universe Peter Parker, I think Andrew Garfield kind of had that nailed. Especially in the first Amazing Spider-Man movie. The second one is a hot mess due to a whole bunch of behind-the-scenes creative choices. But as far as Peter Parker Spider-Man main Marvel Universe, I think Andrew Garfield was probably the best of the bunch.
Yeah, I absolutely think he nailed it. I also think of the three, he was by far the best with the in-suit quips and all of that stuff that is so quintessentially Spider-Man. So, yeah, I'm a big fan, and if we do get to see Garfield back, and I feel like so much of those films is laid on his shoulders, based on all the other issues that he had no part of. But yeah. So Dave, you have a news story for us that is uncharted territory for me, but I've been meaning to tap into. What you got for us?
Well, the other day on Twitter, somebody noted that I tend very independent in my recommendations of comic books. And that's absolutely true. I like to broaden my horizons and look at as many different stories from different publishers and the like as I can. And in that capacity, I came across a comic book called Invincible, which is actually was created by writer Robert Kirkman of Walking Dead fame and artist Cory Walker, and was illustrated by artist Ryan Ottley. And the series ran for 144 issues at Image Comics. And now a teaser trailer dropped for an Amazon Prime animated series that basically will be adapting the first 12 or 13 issues of this comic book series. So Invincible is a character, a superhero. He's the son of Omni-Man, an extraterrestrial superhero of the Vitramite race. And it's sort of a riff, really, off of Superman. Invincible inherits his father's superhuman strength and ability to fly, and he swears to protect the Earth. Little does he know, though, that his father, the world's greatest hero, harbors a dark secret, which is going to put Invincible his whole life on a completely different trajectory. This series, more so than The Walking Dead really, made me a fan of Robert Kirkman. A lot is said about how the industry cannot create new successful superheroes, that in order to have superheroes you need to use the old standbys from DC and Marvel. And this series proves it wrong. Invincible was incredibly successful from a sales perspective, ran for 144 issues, had a couple of spin-off miniseries, and in the end it achieved this success because it was simply very, very good and had something interesting to say about the superhero genre. So the fact that Amazon has made an animated series out of this is very, very exciting. And based on the teaser trailer, it's a very, very good adaptation. The art style of the animated series seems to capture Ryan Ottley's art perfectly. There are many interesting moments that are hinted at in the trailer that fans will recognize from the comic book series. I'm really, really excited for this series, and I can't wait to see it unfold. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this has been sitting in my Comixology library for the longest time, and once I saw this trailer today, I immediately went and started reading it, and it does not disappoint. And I'm a big fan of voice actors, and just listen to this, cast list. You had me at J.K. Simmons, say no more. But I'm looking at the IMDb site right now. You got a lot of the Walking Dead carryovers. You got Stephen Yeun as the main character, Mark Grayson, J.K. Simmons as Omni-Man, Sandra Oh, Seth Rogen, Zazie Beetz, the icon himself, Mark Hamill. I mean, what more do you need? Walton Goggins, one of my favorites, Jason Mantzoukas, who's a huge comic nerd, Mae Whitman, Jillian Jacobs, if you're a Community fan, Zachary Quinto, Spock himself from the Kelvin timeline, Kevin Michael Richardson, who's been in everything. So, I am so excited for this, and I can't wait to dive into this comic and just binge everything before 2021. I'm super excited for this.
And there's a huge twist in that first storyline that I'm not going to spoil here, even though the comic series is several years old. But needless to say, that twist and how it changes the nature of this book and the direction of the next 100-odd issues is really incredible and well worth diving into. The series is more than it appears on the surface.
And I'm super intrigued by this series, and I have been for a while. The reason I put it in my library and my to-read list is when Ryan Ottley joined Amazing Spider-Man as one of the main artists circulating. I was just so fascinated by his art style that I was like, oh, he's famous for Invincible? I really have to check that out. And then with a name like Robert Kirkman, that brings its own gravitas as well. So I really can't wait to get involved and really deep dive into this series.
And, stealth news item, but I just saw on social media yesterday that Ryan Ottley is actually leaving Amazing Spider-Man after 20 issues. Not for any creative differences, but just because he's itching to do something else and apparently has another project with Marvel in the works right now. So I love his art on Invincible. I've loved his art from what I've seen so far on Amazing Spider-Man. So I'm just really excited to see what he gets up to next. He's just a really neat artist, I think, right now. All right, so that's it for our Nerd News segment. Stick around, folks, because we are getting ready to dissect the rotting corpse that is New Mutants. All right, ladies and gentlepeople, and we are back. In our Nerd Big Talk segment for this episode, we want to take a deep dive into the recently released X-Men movie, New Mutants. It's sort of the last gasp of the Fox X-Men franchise. Went through an extremely troubled development, was delayed several times, and finally was sort of unceremoniously released to theaters in the middle of a pandemic. And Kris and I have taken a closer look at this movie and wanted to talk a little bit about our likes and our dislikes of this movie, and in the end, if it's actually worth watching, or if it is the unmitigated disaster that people online have been predicting it will be for several years. So Kris, let's dive in here. What is something about this movie that you actually kind of liked?
What I really liked was their power sets. They were pretty faithful comic adaptations, and they translated well on screen. Particularly, Illyana Rasputin Magic's power set was definitely, she had the soul sword. She had, her arm encased in metal, and she went back and forth to limbo. So that was a pretty faithful adaptation. They switched up the origin story of that, which, I'm not going to get too nitpicky with that. But, Sunspot, turned into a black, fiery, solar-powered, monster. You had Cannonball, just zooming around all over the place. You had Mirage, casting mirages, and then you had, Wolfsbane in all of her growly glory. So I did like, their power sets. I thought it was pretty interesting and a pretty faithful adaptation from page to screen. And it was really cool to see that on the big screen.
I can actually agree with that to a certain extent. I like the fact that we got away at least somewhat from the old standby superpowers. Danny probably came across the best in this department. The idea of drawing out people's fears is super interesting as a superpower. On the other hand, Wolfsbane, sure, is pretty much a standard wolf transformation. Somebody who can fly, okay, so he doesn't have control of it. That's a nice twist on that. A guy who burns, and someone who wields a soul sword. So there is some originality here, I agree with that. And the combination is one we've not seen before. So I kind of liked it, not knowing much about the source material. I was very interested in the power set of these characters. I can totally agree with that.
Yeah, Dave, what is your first like about the film?
Well, as a big fan of horror movies in general, I really like that they try to tap into the horror genre a little bit. There are plenty of scenes, particularly involving this quote-unquote demon bear creature, I guess, that were filmed purposefully to be scary. I don't think the movie ever manages to actually be scary, but there's a lot of moody lighting and the like. There's a distinct sort of, I want to say like pre-horror vibe to the movie, I guess. I particularly appreciated this flashback or vision or whatnot that takes place inside of a mine. The lighting in there was really good. The way the camera operated, it really set a very neat mood. And it gets back to the idea that not every comic book or even superhero story needs to be straight-laced action or adventure. Having a scary superhero story adds much needed diversity to the storytelling. I like the attempt here. I only wish they would have pushed it a little bit further. The effort is appreciated, even though the end result felt a little toothless to me. Kris, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, as we'll see in Nerd Nightmare, the more I dive into the horror genre and really expose myself to it and open myself up to it, that was pretty, in line with what I've been experiencing the last couple of weeks. But I totally agree that it was on the precipice of really delivering something unique. And, whether it was the delayed release of this, the Disney purchase of 20th Century Fox was part of it. the reshoots or whatever that was. And this will probably hint at, some of my dislikes. It very, very much felt like this film feels like a Frankenstein's monster, just a mishmash of, pieces here and pieces there. A lot of it felt disjointed, and, when it's disjointed like that, it's really hard to deliver on the main message. But I like what they were trying to do, is they just didn't really accomplish it all the way.
Yeah, I can agree with that. There's so much potential in superhero movies to diversify the genre a little bit by bringing in other subgenres. I think Captain America, The Winter Soldier did that really well with the sort of 1970s style spy thriller thing. So as long as superhero movies are willing to diversify their approach and the subgenres they use, I think there's really no end in sight for the quality of movies they can make. However, you have to push it all the way, and I don't think this movie necessarily did. So Chris, let's stay positive. What is something else that you really liked about this movie?
I like the symbolism that was inherent in the film. There was a lot of spiritualism vibes. There was the entire concept of the demon bear was really, really fascinating. You had the native tale of two bears. The one that I'm familiar with is two wolves, but if I understand correctly, that's pulled directly from Chris Claremont's script from the original New Mutants title. So that was a really, really cool thing, and it's really, the deep, inspirational vibe of that, about which bear or which wolf that you feed is the one that wins, whether it's the good or the light, whichever you pay attention to, whichever bear or wolf that you give food to, is the one that ultimately wins inside of you. So that was really, really cool. And also the symbolism of your teenage years. I thought that was a really nice meta thing. The fact that New Mutants are supposed to be like the most dangerous mutants because they have all this power and they don't know what to do with it. And I felt that was very emblematic of being a teenager. You have all of this what in vinegar, and you just don't know what to do with it. Like, you and I see this on a daily basis. We have so many kids with all the potential in the world, and it's our job as educators to mold them and put them on the right path towards taking all this talent and all of this gusto that they have and pointing it in the right direction, and so that they are successful with that. And so that was a really, really interesting kind of meta symbolism there with them being so powerful, but they don't know how to channel that. And it really makes me regret a lot of the directions that the X-Men proper films took with the film. The Fox franchises, is they really, really missed out on how essential that was for Charles Xavier and the Xavier, School for Gifted Youngsters. They had a little bit of that with First Class, but then they went other directions. And I really, really wish that, it kind of made me, hindsight's 2020 over the past 20 years of X-Men films within Fox. I wish they would have done that sooner. It's unfortunately it's a little bit too little too late, before, Disney takes over all the way.
Yeah, it's interesting how the School for Gifted Youngsters didn't have a whole lot in the way of youngsters. The idea of exploring teenage angst through superhero stories is really nothing new. It's what made the initial Spider-Man story so good, I think. But it's something that Hollywood, for the most part, has not really tapped into. They traded it in for power fantasies and wish fulfillment. And I'm glad that New Mutants tries to do something more with the topic again, because there is a lot to be said about including, the idea of coming of age, powers, and coming into your powers as a metaphor for growing up. Those sorts of things have made comic books really universally beloved because they really had something to say deep down. And superhero movies don't always necessarily do that. So yeah, I'm very, very glad they tried that here. Even though it didn't perfectly succeed, the effort, much like the horror movie vibes, is definitely appreciated.
All right, Dave, what is next up on your like for the film?
I think that this movie has a bit of a young adult flavor to it, which is a very different approach to take to the X-Men, and I kind of like that. The idea that these are all sort of, teenage protagonists, sure. It just has a different feel, unlike any other X-Men movie, and that's a good thing, especially considering how bad some of the X-Men movies ultimately got. So the idea of using sort of a young adult approach to the source material, I really like. I could totally see this story being the kind of young adult novel my students would read. I think there's a little bit of an attempt to imitate something like Stranger Things, even though the kids are a little older in this movie. Slightly horror, younger cast, the events that are happening are a metaphor for something else. This is very much sort of a Stranger Things kind of thing. They even went so far as to cast an actor from Stranger Things. I believe Charlie Heaton is the one I'm thinking of.
Yes.
Who I fear may be getting typecast a little bit as the quote-unquote white trash teenager. There's definitely sort of a look and feel that he keeps sporting in many of his roles at this point. And he's very talented, and I'd like for him to step outside of that particular niche at some point. But again, using a different approach to superhero stories is a good thing. And here in New Mutants, adding this young adult flavor to it, I would say almost works. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I absolutely think so, and it kind of harkens back to our previous points of it's right there at the precipice, and you really see what they're kind of trying to do, and it's almost like you get like I don't know, like a behind the scenes look and like, hey, this is what we were trying to do, but then it never came to fruition. And like I said before, I don't know if that's a product of all of the changes and all the delays and all of that and the reshoots and everything. But yeah, it just doesn't quite deliver. But, I do appreciate the approach and like, it very much felt like a high school classroom, the kind of things that, they would do when, forced to socialize with one another. A lot of some of the things were a little unfortunate, and we'll get to that in a bit in our dislikes. But it very, very much felt like how teenagers would talk to one another, and that authenticity, I think, lends itself in a very positive way when you're trying to deliver this in a film.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So, Chris, let's get another like in here. What is your final thing that you really liked about this movie?
Okay, this is a light spoiler, so if you have not seen the film, just a heads up, this is a light spoiler warning. I like the twist that Dani's powers, her mirages, if you will, that's her mutant name is Mirage, was really the cause of all these great fears that were tormenting all of them. Like, that was a really, really interesting thing, and it kind of tied back into the symbolism of them being so powerful but not knowing how to handle it. And the more emotionally distressed and the more unstable that she became, the greater that these, visions took over. And the demon bear itself being a construct of her psyche was really, really interesting, and a really interesting interpretation. But, and I thought it felt flat. It fell flat a little bit at the end. The ending and the resolution of the demon bear was kind of lame, but the initial twist was quite interesting. I also liked the tie-ins with the Essex Corporation, and that sounds like something that Nathaniel Essex would do. That sounds perfectly pitch perfect there.
Yeah, I caught the reference to the Essex Corporation, and I realized in the deep recesses of my mind that this is some kind of reference to the source material. But I'm not exactly sure what it was referencing, because again, I'm not as well versed in X-Men lore or even New Mutant lore as you are, Chris. But I like that they kind of name dropped a couple of things like that. I think in one scene they even sort of name dropped Professor X's school and sort of that loose connective tissue that they had with the other X-Men movies and even, with the comic books. I like that almost better than heavy-handed continuity. Sort of having those loose connective tissues is just a little better. It goes back to what I said earlier in our episode about Spider-Man. I think Spider-Man would be well served to have more loose connective tissue like that with the MCU rather than the Avengers metaphorically changing his diaper half of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And here you go. Nathaniel Essex is Mr. Sinister, who himself is not a mutant, but is obsessed with, he's a geneticist and he's obsessed with mutant DNA, and he performs all these mad scientist type tests on, dissecting mutants and splicing their DNA and all that stuff. So this is right in line with his character. So if you know anything about Mr. Sinister, even from the 90s cartoon, this is makes so much sense. So I thought that landed very, very well. Dave, what is your last for this film?
I think the cast is really good. Whoever the casting director was for this movie really knocked it out of the park. The best thing by far about the movie is the cast. Maisie Williams is really good as Rain. Charlie Heaton and Henry Zaga do all right with what they're given. Blue Hunt is a lot of fun to watch. And even Anya Taylor-Joy is very good as Illyana, although I find her character pretty problematic. Something we'll be getting into later in this episode. It's just so sad that a strong cast like this was given such a weak script. I read a much better version of this story not too long back, The Institute by Stephen King. Here, too, a group of young people with special abilities are locked up for future exploitation, and they have to find their way out. King's writing is significantly stronger, for obvious reasons, than the script for this movie. The performances of these very talented actors couldn't quite elevate a story that feels very paint by numbers in places, but they're easily the best part of this movie. I was very much into the cast of this movie. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you said, like what they were given, you can only do so much with what you're given, the script that you're given. But I thought, it doesn't get much better than Maisie Williams as Wolfsbane. That's quintessential casting right there. I thought Anya Taylor-Joy was really, really good as Illyana, but we'll get to that in a moment. The problems that I had with that character. Blue Hunt was a revelation. It's one of those unknowns that we talked about in our last episode. I've never seen any of her work before, and okay, you need to cast her in a bunch of other stuff because she was really, really good. This is my first experience with Charlie Heaton and Henry Zaga's work, and I thought that, like you said, with the material that they were given, I thought they performed, well enough. So in a film that was really spliced together, pun intended, and, had a lot of issues, I felt like they were easily the strong suit. Yeah,
totally. All right, Chris, I think we've reached that point. We've kind of beaten around the bush that this movie has some serious issues. I think it's time that we dive into our dislikes. So here you go, Chris. What's your first dislike of New Mutants?
Right off the bat, it's got to be the characterizations and the creative choices and the script for both Illyana and Dr. Reyes, Dr. Cecilia Reyes. Okay, and I don't want to take too much of your shine here, but just the overall bully mentality of Illyana, that's nothing like her actual character. Like, we talked about this in our third episode about being too nitpicky about source material. That's all fine and dandy, and I think the resolution that we both kind of came to was, we're cool with you changing from the source material unless it completely changes who that character is at their core. And the bully mentality, the racist slurs that Illyana was throwing around just casually is just a total mischaracterization of her. At the same time, Anya Taylor-Joy took what she had and she did her darndest with it. It was just really, really unfortunate, and it's just such a misfire. And Dr. Cecilia Reyes, who is a very, 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 very minor C-list character, perhaps even D-list character of late 90s, early 2000s X-Men comics, who my only exposure to is just through my X-Men read-through. So just quick backdoor biography on her. She is an ER doctor who finds out that she is a mutant, and the force field thing is a faithful adaptation. She can produce force fields, but she is very reluctant to even join the X-Men. She doesn't even want to be a part of that life. She just wants to continue working as an ER doctor, so she doesn't stay on the X-Men team for long. She'll come in and be a physician and help the X-Men, but she has no interest in being involved in that. And then just seeing her be portrayed as this villain is just really questionable. it was one of those things where they tried to, just name drop something from the source material, but it was a complete misfire because this is not who that character is at all. So those two characterizations were highly problematic for me.
And I want to talk a little bit more about Ilyana here in my first point of dislikes. However, I will speak briefly about Dr. Reyes. I found her to be primarily boring. In this particular version of the character, in this particular story, she's in essence the primary antagonist for much of the movie. But she's about as threatening as a round of putt-putt. The villains in this movie are generally... There is no real villain to sink your teeth into. On the one hand, you have Dr. Reyes, which is not particularly villainous ultimately. She doesn't really project villain, and now that I know that this character wasn't even written to be a villain, that makes perfect sense. And then you have, the demon bear situation, which ends up, spoiler alert, being a projection from another character. There's no villainous motivation here either. So there isn't really a clear antagonist in this movie. If the goal was to have Dr. Reyes be the primary villain, that's just weak sauce.
Yeah, and I hinted this in my, my first dislike, but Dave, you're going to go more in depth with your first dislike.
Yeah, I think we need to talk a little about the whole Native American name calling from Ilyana. These teens are supposed to pull together by the end of the story. They're supposed to overcome their differences and become a team of sorts, a group of friends, if you will. And starting them off in an antagonistic position towards each other, and then watching their relationship grow and develop, well, that's smart. It's good character growth. How that antagonism is accomplished with Ilyana, however, is not. Her constant belittling of Danny, a Native American with nicknames like Pocahontas or Standing Rock, feels particularly out of place, given the atmosphere in the country right now. At a time when, professional athletic teams are even rethinking the portrayal of Native Americans as mascots, having a character like Ilyana in the movie just rings hollow. Worse, I don't think she ever quite recovers from these comments. She never quite achieves likability like the other mutants in the group. It's something that hangs over the character to me. There are better ways born out of character to make Ilyana antagonistic towards Danny, rather than falling back on this quote-unquote racism as a starting point. I thought it was a big misstep. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's similar to our criticism of Emma Frost from the Astonishing X-Men homework that I gave you a couple months ago. Is she never really makes this clear, distinct stand as a heroic entity. Like, it's just out of nowhere, all of a sudden, like, they're supposed to be tight. So it's just, like you said, she never recovers. Like, it's to start off something, if you're going to start off with something that nasty and that hateful, you're going to need a longer film than an hour and a half to explore that. So, like you said, it's not the time, it's not the climate to be, having things like that. And it's just really questionable that with all of the cutting and editing and reshoots that this still came out in the final product. Yeah,
totally regrettable. I agree. All right, Chris, give me another dislike. I'm actually looking forward to this next point you got to make because I actually can contribute here a little bit.
Oh my God, it's Lockheed. Like, there's so many problems with this. Number one, it's a freaking felt puppet, Lockheed, and just like the cringiness and the inappropriate, icky nature of her having this like puppet on her hand is just so uncomfortable. Not to mention the line about that Ilyana uses about I can't even repeat it about this puppet, and then the one moment that I'm supposed to like stand and cheer when they go into limbo, spoiler, they go into limbo and Lockheed turns into an actual dragon. That still falls flat for me because Ilyana is not the person who is partnered with Lockheed. That's Kitty Pryde, who you should have been doing a faithful representation and a faithful characterization in the X-Men films, but you didn't do that. So again, we're with this last-ditch effort of this Fox era, and like, oh yeah, I remember this really popular character, and one of, the most iconic aspects of that character, we're going to give it to somebody else completely, and then we're going to relegate it to a sock puppet. It's just incredibly frustrating. And, so I know I've converted you to a Kitty Pryde fan. So yeah, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this as well, Dave.
Yeah, so thanks to the homework you assigned to me, I actually knew who Lockheed was, and his connection with Kitty Pryde from Joss Whedon's X-Men run. As such, I really liked the character in the comic books, and so him showing up here was really odd, and I was like, Lockheed? The felt puppet thing? Nah, that's not right. And then again, the connection that is always hinted at in the comic books between Kitty Pryde and Lockheed is one of like a deep friendship. Why would Lockheed want to hang out with such a deeply unlikable character as Ilyana is kind of confusing to me. And I know it was meant as a fun insider thing, blah, 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 but it came across as wrong-headed. It's about as wrong-headed as going into a Superman movie and Robin shows up as Superman's sidekick instead of Batman's. Like, it's just the wrong character in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it does not work.
Now, I will freely admit, in the comics, Kitty Pryde and Ilyana Rasputin, who is the sister of Colossus, Pyotr Rasputin, in the comics, are very close. They're like best friends. So, like, that makes sense, that connection. But you didn't go for that in this movie. You gave her a completely retcon, completely different origin story, so the Lockheed connection makes no sense. So, yes, Ilyana has a history with Lockheed via her relationship with Kitty Pryde and them being best friends and, Kitty dating Peter for years in the comics, but none of that is in continuity here in this film, and it's cool, once again, as we said, if you change the origin story, if you don't go via the source material, but this is just like changing so many different things that it doesn't make sense on any level. Dave, what is your second dislike of the film?
So this has just become, I don't know, a tired trope in my eyes, and I'm kind of getting tired of seeing it trotted out over and over again. It's sort of this dead horse that people just will not stop beating, and I'm like, please leave the horse be, hasn't it suffered enough? And that's, the notion of religion and faith and how it is portrayed in Hollywood movies and even in novels to some extent, just in pop culture in general. Stop me if you heard this one before. A character or characters suffer horrible trauma because an authority figure's faith or religion. A great example of this is Stephen King's Carrie. It's quintessential. Carrie's mother is kind of shown to be this religious fanatic and is abusive towards Carrie in the story in large part because of that. And this is by far not the only case in pop culture. And I've grown really weary of this one-dimensional portrayal of faith and religion in Hollywood. Sure, Rain can transform into a wolf, so let's get an angry priest to declare that she's going to hell and brand her. Perfect. Not. It's a trope, and it's become way too ubiquitous. And in my experience, people of faith come in all shapes and sizes. Sure, there are what we could call the quote-unquote crazies, but there are also plenty of good people of faith. So why is it then that so often they are automatically portrayed as misguided or even evil? The priest in this story encounters Rain and lives in a world in continuity with the X-Men movies. At least have him acknowledge that she's probably a mutant, not some kind of weird demon thing or something. Geez, in an X-Men movie, wouldn't it make more sense for a mutant to be hated for being a mutant? It's just very odd to me to take that approach. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so my source material knowledge on the New Mutants is sketchy at best. My only experience with them is like crossover events from my X-Men read through, and so I feel like this is straight from the source material, but I feel like this is similar to an M'Baku update when we saw that character updated that has kind of regrettable origins in the comics that, years later are better, if you reinterpret them. That's one way where it makes sense to change from the source material. M'Baku is a really, really kind of racially insensitive, interpretation of the man ape, which is really kind of disgusting and icky. And the way that they switched that for the Black Panther film, I thought was just genius. Like, I never even saw that coming. When they cast M'Baku, I was like, oh boy, how are they going to handle this? And, especially with a talented actor like Winston Justice, like, you couldn't ask for better. And M'Baku is one of my favorite parts of that. And
mine as well, yeah.
Bringing together of all the tribes of Wakanda is just, it just brings tears to your eyes, how beautiful that was. And I feel like this is another case where we should have updated it. Because there are plenty of fantastic X-Men storylines of, anti-mutant religious propagandists who, some of the best X-Men stories come, with antagonists like William Stryker, who is, an evangelist, who, believes that mutants are an abomination and an act against God. And it's just much more well thought out than just this tropey Catholic priest, trotted out, and you don't have, here's the problem too, is you didn't develop like enough of a backstory for this to where that is meaningful, if your movie was longer than an hour and a half, then, and that's the problem with making an hour and a half team up movie with so many different characters. And I felt like this was one of the problems with Sam Guthrie Cannonball and, Roberto da Costa Sunspot is they got like zero, next to nothing time with their backstories. And it was just all very rushed and all just put together. So like if you would have spent more time with this and made it more like well thought out, like I know the MCU gets, a lot of flack for its villains and lack of backstory, but it's nothing compared to how poorly thought out this was.
Yeah, I agree. So, final dislike, Chris, what have you got?
Well, and this was one of the biggest reasons I was hesitant to see this film is Roberto da Costa Sunspot is one of my absolute favorite characters in all of comics. Like, if you want to read good Roberto da Costa, look up Jonathan Hickman writing Birdo. Like, in his Avengers, when you have Birdo and Sam, like, their kinship and they're like best friends, like, that's amazing. And so, like, the relationship between Birdo and Sam was really lame for me in this movie. And that, I knew that was going to be a tall order going in, but the entire representation of Roberto da Costa in this movie is highly problematic. And there was a lot of criticism online with whitewashing the character of Sunspot. Henry Zaga, I have to be authentic here and I have to be truthful. I really, enjoyed his performance. I thought he was pretty strong with what he was given. The only problem is, as we've talked about on this podcast before, when you limit yourself when it comes to narrow-mindedness, at least when it comes to diversity, when you like limit yourself and paint yourself into a corner, you really limit the story that you're able to tell. And I found a fantastic article by Michelle Jaworski on Daily Dot talking about this, how director Josh Boone, really, went to bat for this casting of Henry Zaga, who, according to his IMDb page, is Brazilian. So that is accurate from the comic description. He is, Brazilian actor. However, his mother is of Spanish and native Brazilian descent, and his father is Italian and Portuguese descent. So he is he is, for all intents and purposes, of a European descent, even though he was born in Brazil. Now, the problem with that is Roberto da Costa is biracial. And his, background as being Afro-Brazilian or, Black Brazilian is quintessential to his character. And it's really, really problematic, especially when you have director Josh Boone saying things, and I'm reading directly from the quote. I didn't care so much about the racism I've heard about in Brazil, about light-skinned versus dark-skinned, he continued. To me, it was, I wanted to represent Brazil in a positive way, and I wanted to find somebody who seems like he could look like a guy who's had the silver spoon in his mouth, who has like a really rich dad, and Henry just exemplified all those things. So that's like, kind of problematic that you're coming out and say it had to be a white guy that, had a silver spoon in his mouth, that and you're not interested in tackling, an issue like that, which, I'll give him the fact that if you only got an hour and a half to work with, you don't really have a lot of time to develop that. But I really think that Michelle Jaworski nailed it in her next paragraph in this, and I'm reading directly quoting from her article on Daily Dot. While a certain aspect of criticism over comics accuracy in movie adaptation can get nitpicky at times, that's not the case at all for Roberto da Costa. His biracial heritage is part of his story. In the character's first appearance in Marvel graphic novel number 4, his powers manifest because he's the target of a racist attack by white classmates during a soccer game. Roberto's father, Emmanuel, is also Afro-Brazilian. He's a ruthless businessman who joins a secret society that aims to gain power through immoral means, the Hellfire Club, for those of you who are X-Men fans. Boone's assertion that Zaga was his vision of a, quote, guy who's had the silver spoon in his mouth, end quote, versus an Afro-Brazilian actor is, if anything, incredibly limiting and short-sighted. So again, I have no problems with what Henry Zaga did with the character. I just think it's a real, it really falls flat what they could have done with the character, and like the power and the resonance that they could have brought to this film. It also, for me, honestly, was a little bit tropey and a little bit convenient that everybody killed somebody when their powers manifested themselves. Like, okay, Sam's story of, killing his father and all the people in the mine, that one kind of landed. But then Sunspot also killed his girlfriend, and Ilyana killed all these people. Like, this is all the same story. There's no switching it up. So, yeah, I really felt like, and maybe I'm just, being nitpicky on my favorite character, but I feel like when you're painting yourself into a corner and you're really avoiding stories like that, you're really also avoiding a better and deeper and more resounding story. So what do you think about that, Dave?
So this is a really complicated issue, and ultimately, I have to be honest, I am the palest of crackers and probably not the best person to really speak on issues of race, but I am a long-term reader of comic books and stories in general. And I think there's something that I can say here. And I'm going to kind of go around the curve here to get to my point. I'm a big fan of what I've seen so far of the new James Gordon, Jeffrey Wright. The character in the comic books is Caucasian, but is portrayed in the new movie The Batman by an African American. And when it comes to race or gender-bending characters, the bare minimum, I think, should always be that changing that aspect of the character doesn't detract from the character. At best, making changes to the race or gender of a character actually adds new layers to the character. I think this is the potential for the casting of James Gordon. I think there's potential for added layers to that character here. So for me, the casting of Sunspot, as is, doesn't really work because it doesn't add a new dimension to the character, but instead detracts an element from the character. So I think that at all times needs to be the bare minimum. You cannot change a character's ethnicity or a character's gender unless it adds, or at the very least does not detract from the essence of the character. And in Sunspot's case, the casting simply fails that test.
Yeah, and I think of just the ones off the top of my head from, movies that I've seen, recently, or I've seen a lot of, Nick Fury, which, is a comics accurate, iteration of the ultimate Nick Fury, the son of the Caucasian, Nick Fury from comics. It doesn't get much better, when you have a connected universe, when you have an individual like Samuel L. Jackson. Like, I feel like if without him, a lot of the MCU doesn't work. So you need him as that central figure, putting this universe together. Tessa Thompson was a revelation in Thor Ragnarok. And she got a lot of crap for that. But like, find me somebody that's better fit in that role. Like Valkyrie, like immediately was one of the best parts of that movie. So Heimdall, like a lot of crap went Idris Elba's way, who's personally one of my all-time favorite actors. I will watch anything that dude is in, and I'm excited for the Suicide Squad with him in it. And I thought that he brought this presence as Heimdall, as like the all-seeing one, and just this like big presence. And I felt like he added so much to that role. So I totally agree with you, and I feel like they could have had so much more with this role if they would have done, a better job casting. Dave, what is your final dislike for this?
Well, this is going to come across as maybe a bit overly negative or facetious. I don't know. But to me, I gave it an honest shot, but New Mutants is simply not a very compelling movie. It's boring, actually. And while preparing for this podcast, I actually had to go back several times just to look up character names, because there's really not that much memorable about them beyond their powers. Then, right when there's going to be a confrontation between Dr. Reyes and the kids, boom, Demon Bear kills what I thought was the main antagonist. Felt very anticlimactic. Bring in the Demon Bear so we can have special effects heavy finale rather than focusing on the person that was actually the villain for most of the movie. It's just boring and anticlimactic and paint by the numbers in a lot of cases. Whether a movie is good or bad, I don't care. I've had plenty of fun watching bad movies. The biggest sin a movie can commit in my book is being boring, and New Mutants is exactly that. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, after an hour and a half, like, I keep referencing back to that, but like an hour and a half, I'm like, what did I get from that? And the only things when I try, I'm a very macro person, so I like macro. Like, what did I gain from viewing that film? And it wasn't a lot, and I think a lot of that goes back to this Frankenstein's monster setup of this movie. It feels very spliced together. And I said this before, like when you have a team up movie and you give, they gave Danny a lot of backstory. They didn't give a lot of backstory to anybody else. So like you said, they're not memorable characters. And unless you're a big mutant fan like me, you're not going to remember the names because they didn't really deliver anything. And there's no meaning to all of it. And especially, spoiler alert, when you have like the climactic resolution of the film is just her petting the demon bear on the nose. That's the end of it? Really? That's how you defeat the quote-unquote villain of this film? It just really falls flat, and there's no staying power with this movie. And it's just really... It's really interesting because in some ways it was a lot better than a lot of the X films that we saw. But, at the end of the day, it was just like snuffing the pillow out of the Fox franchise of Marvel films in a lot of respects.
Why in the world didn't the Avengers try this with Thanos? Just rub his nose and see if maybe he just goes away. Maybe he just had an itchy nose. Well, I don't know. What I do know is that wraps up our Nerd Big Talk on Fox's New Mutants. Hopefully there are brighter days ahead for the X-Men franchise in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Let's go ahead and go to break. When we come back, a new installment of October's Nerd Nightmare. Let's see what horrors Chris had to be subjected to next. And we're back, ladies and gentle people. So glad you stuck around. Let's go ahead and do our new October segment, Nerd Nightmare, where Chris, a horror movie newbie, is exposed to some of the all-time classic scary movies. This week's movie is John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978, starring Jamie Lee Curtis, probably one of the originators of the slasher subgenre. Kris, you dove into this movie for the very first time. What's your impression of this movie?
Well, right off the bat, I wasn't really scared of this movie, so I'm really thinking now that, I just missed out on a lot, growing up, because I wasn't really scared at any point during this movie. So I'm really wondering, and I'm really expanding my viewing and choosing other media when I have my downtime. So that's the overarching thing that I gained from watching this movie. But, just here's my bulleted list of reactions as I went through. First and foremost, the music is just incredible. It doesn't get better than that. The Halloween theme, and it's John Carpenter. There's a certain authenticity when you have projects like this, when you have John Carpenter doing basically all the things, and you had the same thing with Night of the Living Dead, when you have George A. Romero doing basically everything on the film. You have John Carpenter going back and doing the score for this movie. I mean, it's pitch perfect, pun intended. It's so good. One of the biggest reactions that I really appreciated about watching this movie is it was like traveling in a time machine. It was really cool to see Jamie Lee Curtis in her first on-screen appearance. It was like I said, it was in a time machine. You get to see this actress who's, now advanced in age, and she's been, a Hollywood A-lister for so many years. To see her on screen for the first time was really like going in a time machine back to 1978. And she's just magnetic. It's like watching an origin story in the process. She's just magnetic on screen. You could see it happening. And she's a scene chewer, and she has such a commanding presence on screen. And she is by far the best part of the film. The fact that she did this for $6,000 as her first thing on screen was just crazy to think about, all these years later. I thought also in my research before I viewed it, Dr. Loomis was originally supposed to be Grand Moff Tarkin himself, Peter Cushing, but they could only offer him $20,000, and that wasn't enough for him to bite. But Donald Pleasance was fantastic, all the same. He was almost like Shakespearean in a sense, the way he was talking about it and the lighting in those scenes where he's talking about how awful Michael Myers is. That was just really, really cool to see. Also, why the F are they babysitting kids on Halloween night? What are those parents doing? These tiny little kids should be going around trick-or-treating, and apparently they've got some, adult party that they're going to, and they're pawning off these teenagers on. That was lame. Is Michael Myers actually the Archangel Michael smiting those who participate in premarital sex? A lot has been made online, speculation of, Michael is, really this upholder of chastity and wants to smite those who have sex before marriage. But then again, he does go after Laurie, who is, a plain Jane, stays at home babysitting and, doesn't have a boyfriend. He goes after her as well. So maybe that doesn't, that fan theory doesn't really hold up. I really found it some delicious irony. Maybe this is kind of callous of me, but, I'm at the point in my life where I have 0 F's to give. The delicious irony that the sheriff is dismissive of the danger that Michael presents, and then his daughter is one of the first victims, is just fantastic. That's some delicious irony. I've never seen a house before with a separate laundry, actual room that's separate from the house, so that was weird. You can see where this film, like Night of the Living Dead, a lot of my friends told me this movie also established a lot of the tropes, and, it makes sense from the really idiotic behavior by Annie, Bob, Linda, all the people got killed. I'm like, yep, you deserve to die because you're stupid. Also, a lot of the slashing was pretty telegraphed, predictable. Part of the reason I probably wasn't scared is yep, you're about to die because you're alone and the music's starting. So while I love the music when they're oh yeah, you're about to die because the music's starting. It tells me you're about to die. Also, Laurie is just bad A for fighting him off. She's just this teenage girl, and she's taking care of business. I saw a lot of parallels between her and Ben. I love characters who come on screen and they don't hem and haw and whine, and they just take their life into their own hands, and they take the situation and be like, I'm doing this. And she's this like teenage girl, and the closet scene is just awesome. She just grabs a coat hanger and just starts stabbing dude in the neck. She takes like a knitting needle. It's just like, oh, that didn't work, let me try this knitting needle. Cha cha cha. Then she picks up Michael's own knife and starts stabbing him with it. I'm like, you go, girl. So yeah, like female empowerment. And now I see why like Jamie Lee Curtis, shot to the stardom that she did, because like this is amazing. And then my final point, just kind of circling back, Michael's parents, like, what the F? Like, you didn't see this coming? Like, what 6-year-old just all of a sudden just stabs his sister, like, silently? If you have a kid just walk around quietly like that, why is he unattended? Like, y'all should have seen this coming. So yeah, a lot of parenting fails in this movie.
I'm totally enjoying your takes on some of these classics, watching them for the first time. For me, it's actually really difficult to talk about Halloween because so much has been said about this movie over the years. It's still one of my absolute favorites. I remember a couple of Halloweens ago actually watching Halloween on the big screen in a local theater that was just showing, scary movies. It's such a trailblazer in the slasher subgenre, and it's a masterclass in storytelling. I always love the simple, straightforward story of this one. A killer escapes a mental health facility and heads back to his hometown to finish what he started years ago. Carpenter's script is simple, but it's never boring. I feel like New Mutants could have learned a thing or two from him in that regard. Even better is Carpenter's minimalistic score. You're exactly right. This score is ridiculously good. It's catchy. I think for October, it just needs to be my ringtone on my cell phone. It's almost too perfect to be true. And the movie does such a fantastic job creating tension. I really love the work that went into the point of view shots from Michael Myers' perspective, which is something that hadn't really been done in movies before. So even in that opening, when he first attacks his sister and you have the camera basically like behind his mask, that is such a fantastic shot and does such a good job of putting the audience in a place of unease because they're literally watching through the eyes of a killer. I love that he keeps popping up in the background, and then suddenly he's gone. It's just this like looming shadow throughout the movie. And yes, I totally agree with you. Jamie Lee Curtis is fantastic here. She captures the everyday average teen in her performance perfectly, and she always seems like her character is operating at her maximum capacity. One of the things I hate about characters in horror movies is that they oftentimes seem, like you said, like they're acting really dumb for plot convenience. But Laurie Strode always seems to be operating at her absolute best. She doesn't make those super stupid mistakes. She's always trying to think ahead, and I really appreciate a character like that. And Donald Pleasance as Dr. Loomis is one of my favorite parts of the movie. The man has at least half a dozen impromptu monologues about the evil of Michael Myers prepared to go at all times. like you stand somewhere in silence with that man for 5 minutes, and he's going to be like, Michael Myers is evil. One time I saw him in a cell, and he's just going to go for it. He's going to tell you about why Michael Myers is evil. And finally, it has to go mentioned that I hope that the fan theories are wrong and this is not supposed to be some kind of avenging Archangel Michael, because let's just all agree that there is no way that an Archangel would look like William Shatner's bleached face.
Can I just say one final thought on this movie? I'm going to raise my glass to nerdy girls representing, and Laurie Strode is a nerdy girl, and she is not pushed into a corner because she's a bookworm and she's a good student and all these things. And, she's not just giving it up to any guy down the street. I want to, raise a glass to all the nerdy girls around the world representing and owning it and performing to their max, just like Laurie. So to all the Laurie nerdy girls out there listening, represent.
Absolutely. Well, there you have it, folks. That's it for another episode of the Nerd Byword podcast. I hope you enjoyed the ride this week. As always, we'll have a new episode next week. Feel free to give us a like, a rating, a 5-star review on any podcasting platform where you found us. We're available wherever podcasts can be found. You can also find us on social media, individually at That Nerd Kris and at That Nerd Dave, or at Nerd Byword.
Yeah, be sure to check us out on Instagram. We're almost up to 1,500 followers, so we appreciate all of your support. Keep there's always some fun, cool, collecting, comic-y stuff going on there. So be sure to check us out on Instagram especially. But we thank you so much for your support. We've got some really cool things lined up. We've got some more fantastic interviews coming down the pipe. We really want to feature some more indie creators, so we always want to support the little guy like ourselves. And it's just really fun to see new stuff coming down the pipe. So, as always, stay well and stay nerdy.
The Nerd Byword is written and produced by Kris and Dave, two nerds with a love of all things pop culture. The podcast features music by Al Jimenez and show art by Ashery Design. Find us at nerdbyword.com and wherever podcasts are available.